everyone, and great to see so many of you here today. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Yadvinder Mali. I'm Professor of Ecosystem Science here at the university and Director of our Leverhulme Centre for Nature Recovery. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce my friend Sandra Díaz, who is she's a professor at the University of Cordoba in Argentina, but for several years she's also a visiting Martin School fellow here. So she comes for several months. She just arrived this week and she'll be here until July. So if any of you want to interact more with her, do take advantage of her stay here. Now Sandra has many accomplishments, which I won't repeat here. But as an ecologist, she's been very influential in thinking about many aspects of ecology, but particularly the global form of plants and why plants vary and how they vary across the taxonomic and geographical world. But she's also had a huge role in the translation of science into policy as co-chair, vice chair of the Intergovernmental Platform for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, and many other things. And for her role, I think particularly in translating science into policy, she's had a number of accolades, but most recently she's been awarded the Tyler Prize, which is widely recognized as the Nobel Prize for the Environment. So congratulations to Sandra for that. But actually, with little further ado, over to you, Sandra. Welcome. I should also mention the talk is recorded and the Q&A will be recorded afterwards as well. So be aware of that in terms of your questions.
Thank you, Yadvinder, for this kind introduction. I am very grateful to the Oxford Martin School and the Leverhulme Centre for Nature Recovery for this invitation and for the fellowship that is allowing me to be part of the Oxford intellectual atmosphere. These days, we feel that our lifeways are at stake. The planet seems to be on fire all around us, literally as well as metaphorically. And every day of inaction counts. Why then should we dwell on narratives, on stories now? Well, simply because we human beings process the world, build the world through stories, through narratives, through metaphors. As George Lakoff reminded us in this seminal book, narratives help us making sense of the world by illuminating some aspects of reality and obscuring some others. They provide scaffolding for thinking, which in turn frame action and institutions. Crucially, narratives are used to propagate specific sets of values. They tell us what is expected from us, what is acceptable and not acceptable to do. They provide a purpose for us, a sense of purpose in life. Lakoff wrote his book in the early 1980s, so a lot of things have changed since then. Today, we are in the middle of culture wars, alternative truths, and a general undermining of evidence-based thinking. So, if anything, the importance of metaphors and narratives has never been so evident. And the narratives about nature and our relationship with it are no exception to these dynamics. Over the past century or so, different narratives about nature, together with their own definitions and buzzwords, have colored international environmental negotiations, country policies, the themes we researchers investigate, the causes for which civil society organizations fight for. In a broad simplification, there have been two major narratives about nature. There is nature as useful to humans, nature as natural resources to be conquered and exploited. This is the social narrative I call nature as spoils, like in the spoils of war. There are different opinions of how to distribute those spoils, but all boil down to the fact that nature is there to serve us. We have the right to use it as we please. In parallel, there is another narrative in which nature is much more than natural resources. Nature has a right to exist for its own sake and deserves respect. But to be proper nature, it has to be as close as possible to a primeval, Eden-like state. And in order to be able to go back to this pristine state, it has to be as human-free as possible. This is a narrative in which the ideal to aim for is pristine wilderness, and humans are seen basically as intruders. This narrative came to prominence with the European Romantics and the American Transcendentalists, and it has been enshrined very explicitly in some early pieces of legislation about the environment, such as the US Wilderness Act. This is the narrative I call nature as Eden. Opposites as they superficially like, these two narratives are actually two different sides of the same coin, because both rest on the assumption of a stark separation between the human domain and the natural domain. And the nature as spoils and the nature as Eden narratives have had huge influence in the way we think about nature and also in the way we build institutions around it. There is a third, newer narrative. Until about 20 years ago, biodiversity, nature, the biosphere were firmly located within the realm of natural sciences. But then social scientists and environmental humanities scholars started getting interested in the big environmental crisis. And they started arguing that the deep roots and the possible solutions to the climate change crisis, to the biodiversity collapse crisis, etc., were all deeply social. So we saw more and more actors claiming a place at the table of international environmental assessments and international intergovernmental conventions, such as the Convention on Biological Diversity. And a new narrative arises that emphasizes the deep and intricate links between a highly heterogeneous humanity and other life on Earth. This is the intellectual scaffolding that supports the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, or IBES, or the IPCC of biodiversity. And as such, this idea of nature underpins all the IBES assessments, including this flagship assessment, the Global Assessment on Biodiversity and What It Means to People, that I had the privilege to share together with Eduardo Brondisio and Joseph Setele. Now, if I was asked to summarize in one message this 1,400 pages document. I would say the message is the inextricable entanglement between humans as individuals, as members of societies, as humanity as a whole, and other life on Earth. Virtually all aspects of human existence are deeply dependent on nature. And on the other hand, the vast majority of ecosystems bear the stamp of humans, some of these humans living quite far away. So, on the basis of this conceptual thinking and the massive evidence, in one of the flagship products of the assessment, this article in Science, we presented formally to the peer review community the notion of nature as a living fabric. Now, is this notion radically different from the more mainstream definition of biodiversity? For many practical purposes in the everyday life of a biologist, no. I personally use them exchangeably in many circumstances. But there are two or three very important differences. A notion of nature as a living fabric highlights relationships, connections, evolutionary connections due to common ancestry, and ecological present-day connections because the constant exchange of materials, both locally and remotely through telecoupling. The notion of nature as a living fabric also highlights our deep dependence and also our deep and pervasive shaping of other life on Earth. And crucially, this metaphor resonates much more strongly, intellectually and emotionally, with a large number of people with no training in biology that nevertheless take everyday decisions which have consequences for life on Earth. I guess the point I'm trying to make here is that all definitions are essentially metaphors. And different narratives, each has their own metaphors and definitions associated to them. So maybe if we want another narrative of nature, we need another definition. A definition that doesn't resemble a catalog of objects out there, but rather a fabric, a tapestry, a big tangle in which we are all embedded. So, what would be a narrative that matches this notion of nature as a living fabric? Certainly not the nature as Eden or the nature as spoils ones. So I would like to propose we explore a narrative of nature as garden. I am very aware that the garden metaphor has been used many times over history. But let me share with you why I think it's fruitful and timely right now. A nature as garden narrative incorporates humans explicitly. People are an integral part of the system, not intruders. It also makes room for positive human agency. Humans are not just the destroyers of nature. It gives space for the very many different forms of reciprocity between humans and the non-human, and also gives space for the very many forms of nature stewardship that exist around the world and have been largely ignored by both the Eden and the spoils narratives for different reasons. A nature as garden narrative also emphasizes that a garden is a source of concrete benefits, but also you have to establish a relationship. You get a lot of very anthropocentric, instrumental values from a garden, sure enough, but also involves other values, relational values. You exploit the garden, yes, you use it, but it needs care and respect. You don't conquer your garden, squeeze it dry and move on. You stick to it. It highlights selectivity of human interactions with other life, pointing to the fact that human actions is, sure, extermination, but also a lot of nuanced shaping. And last but not least, nature as garden narrative highlights the fact that control is never permanent and is never total. Whoever has tended a garden personally knows that you are never in control totally and for a long time. A garden is a constant source of expected benefits, expected satisfactions, but also a constant source of surprises, of nuances. In my case, I think of ants and caterpillars and parakeets. You may be thinking of slugs, probably. Gardens are full of non-human agency, and they may be even a source of fear, which points to the need for coexistence. Coexistence, which is not always rosy harmony, sometimes it's difficult, and requires negotiation and humility. Now, the nature as garden narrative begs a critical question. Whose garden we are talking about? If there's no objectively determined right state of nature to aim for, what are the trajectories to be favored? Whose priorities and values should predominate? What is the process we have in place to determine the different goals, especially if the goals are biologically incompatible with each other? All of these are very necessary and very difficult questions. But perhaps at this point, you may be wondering why all this talk about narratives matter in practice right now. I think it matters because narratives don't replace each other neatly over time. They tend to overlap with each other, coexist with each other to a large degree. Especially very well-established narratives die very hard. So one tends to buy very quickly into new stories, but one's behavior, individual behavior, but also regulations, legislation, tend to lag behind, tend to respond to narratives one doesn't believe any longer. Specifically, these twin narratives, Eden and spoils, are very tenacious, and they live on in many, many of our regulations and legislations. So that is why narratives matter today. So in the second part of this talk, I would like to touch upon some findings, ideas, policy tools, and I would like to touch upon them under the light of Fabric of Life, Nature as Garden. And I choose this because they illustrate different scales, and also because they are relevant to policy. All of them being explicitly consider in the most important intergovernmental policy instrument we have today, which is the Global Biodiversity Framework of the Convention on Biological Diversity. Starting from the broad scale, the Global Biodiversity Framework has some targets that are about the biodiversity footprints of consumption and trade by countries, by business, and by individuals. A fabric of life look at this suggests that we should be paying much more attention to connections beyond the country boundaries because of the massive teleconnections, the massive telecouplings between distant regions. Telecouplings are these long-distance connections between people and other forms of life, or between people and other people through the bodies of other forms of life. And these have increased hugely in the last 70 years or 50 years, about 900 times. And they can have huge consequences for life on Earth. For example, the work of Manfred Lenzen and colleagues shows that as much as 30% of the global threats to animals due directly or indirectly to consumption don't originate in the same country where the animals live. They originate somewhere else. And a very concrete example you may be interested in is the UK. The consumption in the UK threatens more than 300 species domestically and more than 400 species abroad. This is not an awful lot if you compare it with the threats by the US, for example. More than 400 species 4,000 species domestically, and almost 2,000 species abroad. But the UK is one of the few selected net importers, meaning that more species are threatened by implicated imports than are threatened by domestic production. So, a good move for me would be that countries would monitor and report, for example, in their national communications, not only their domestic biodiversity footprints, but also their global footprints. To me, that would be a huge step forward, although I do realize the formidable political resistance that this could probably provoke. Another interesting issue here is ecosystems in peril. They feature prominently in the Global Biodiversity Framework. And here is an idea that is very, very deeply anchored in Western conservation. It's almost an obsession. And that's the idea of the wilderness. To me, the obsession, the fixation with the wilderness is a legacy of the nature as Eden narrative. Of course, wilderness areas are extremely important for many, many reasons, and we should be doing everything we can to keep them. But they're definitely not the only nature that deserves attention and care. First, they represent only, at most, a quarter of the land surface and substantially less of the ocean surface. And they already bear substantial footprint by humans. First, there are people that have been living there and using them for centuries of millennia, and they have every right to keep being there and keep using them. And also, they are under the increasing threat of external drivers. No matter how well managed these wilderness protected areas are, they cannot be completely extricated from the connections in which, in the tangle of the connections in which they are embedded. So they are under increasing influence of higher temperatures, of atmospheric and water pollution, and global pathogens. There's no way to fence the protected wildernesses away from this telecoupled influence. They can only be acknowledged and managed. A third issue that to me is very relevant to this conversation is nature's contributions to people, or NCP. This is a notion, a pluralistic and transdisciplinary notion that refers to all the good things, benefits, and all the bad things, detriments, that nature does for us, with us, and to us. They include ecosystem services, but they go well beyond. This is a notion that emerged in the context of IBES, but now has spread to many other fields, including being explicitly enshrined in the Global Biodiversity Framework, in Goal B and derived targets. Now, benefits can only be realized as such if they are beneficiaries. Some nature's contributions to people are well mixed across the planet. They are global, so it doesn't really matter where exactly is the ecosystem that produces them. Examples are the carbon sequestration and water and moisture recycling by big chunks of vegetation. But the vast majority of NCPs, nature's contributions to people, are local in nature. In order to benefit from them, you need to be near. Examples: crop pollination, the purification of water and air, noise buffering, climate change buffering. The vast majority of material contributions that are not commodified, the vast majority of non-material contributions, including sense of place, sense of identity, inspiration, virtually all the health benefits associated with being close to nature. So, a bulk value for the whole planet of a local NCP doesn't make any sense, because there's no mechanism for people to benefit from it unless they are close enough. So with that preoccupation in mind, and led by Becky Chaplin-Kramer, we set out to identify and map the ecosystems that provide at least 90% of the levels of a very broad range of NCPs, going from food to soil and water regulation to recreation. And we did that for global NCPs, which are, again, the moisture recycling and carbon sequestration, and we also did it for the local NCPs. And I would like you to concentrate in the local ones, the green areas. We found that only 30% of the land area is necessary to keep 90% of the levels we have now of these important locally delivered NCPs. A little bit less for coastal areas. But if you see the overlap between these areas that deliver critical natural assets, critical local NCPs around the world, and the wilderness areas, there's very little overlap. The vast majority of these local NCPs are delivered by the underrated ecosystems in these pink areas, the so-called shared ecosystems or shared landscapes. Now, there is very abundant evidence that these shared landscapes in almost everywhere in the world, in tropical rainforest, subtropical dry forest, Mediterranean scrub, all sorts of temperate grasslands and forest, are home of a very high diversity and vibrant, resilient ecosystem processes, and lots of local nature's contributions to people, both material and non-material, including keeping our options open for the future, including keeping options open for the future for food security, more specifically. So why are these ecosystems so comparatively understudied? I see here the outdated narratives at play, one again. Ecologists and environmental activists just don't find them close enough to Eden, so they look down on them. And what is worse, this negative image about them, this negative narrative about these shared ecosystems, is taken advantage of by other social actors. For example, the industrial agriculture and other lobbies use these negative narratives to push for encroachment over them. A specific example, this is the qualifiers used by industrial agriculture and real estate development lobbies in central Argentina to diminish this vibrant, resilient, and highly diverse ecosystem. This is the central Argentina Chaco forest. So they could get enough social license to convert them. Now, going to smaller and smaller scales, the closer one gets to more humanized landscapes, urban landscapes, agricultural landscapes, the more the narratives clash. So what would be the implications of a nature as garden narrative for these working and living landscapes? Here is where the debate gets really exciting. And here is where the question, whose nature or whose garden are we talking about, is particularly crucial. The Global Biodiversity Framework calls for interspersing bits of wildness, if not wilderness, in the landscapes people cultivate and live from and live in every day. And I think this is quite matching with a nature as garden narrative. When we talk about urban spaces, there's not much disagreement. The vast majority of people think that green spaces, wild bits in cities, are a good thing. They have huge benefits. For example, they can lower the surface temperature by 3 degrees on average in the warmest season. And there's increasingly abundant and convincing evidence of all the psychological and physical and social health benefits of being close to a bit of nature every day. So if anything, here the debate is about how to make this greening fair, because most of the green space tends to be concentrated to the more gentrified areas, with less and less access by the poorer and least advantaged. So, as I said, no big debates here. Completely different story altogether for agricultural landscapes, on whether and how to build these wild bits among agricultural plots. Here there are several libraries, and the two extremes of them, in a bit of a cartoonish simplification, are the intensification approach and the diversification approach. This is a very lively debate with so much evidence and so much opposing arguments on both camps that it would take me the whole talk and probably a whole symposium to make justice to them. So I'm not going to here today, but there are some arguments that really resonate with me. From a fabric of life point of view, any strategy that separates people from nature, whatever its other advantages, is bound to have downsides, especially for the least privileged. And these downsides need to be considered quite carefully before implementing anything. In a nutshell, you only benefit from your garden if you have it close by and you can visit very frequently. If your garden is gorgeous but you have no access to it, there's no benefit to you. That's the essence of the argument. On the other hand, it's true that these wild bits interspersed in human landscapes are not particularly good to preserve unique biodiversity of high conservation value, such as endemic species or charismatic megafauna. It's true that sometimes they are messy and a bit inefficient to manage, but this less than unique and less than glamorous biota is not without value. The anthropophilic biota that thrives in the open, disturbed, often nutrient-rich conditions we create all around us is very diverse and needs our proximity to persist. A well with perfect separation between highly intensified agricultural patches and wilderness doesn't have much room for them. And this humble nature has a very large number of benefits to people. They are important for sense of identity, they are important for health, they are important for climate change buffering, they are important for our future resilience because they are highly adaptable and they tend to evolve very fast. So these humble bits of nature, what the conservationist Aldo Leopold called idle spots, and what the nature writer Emma Maris calls trashy ecosystems, deserve more attention. There's yet another reason in favor of these everyday wild spots. By having them close from childhood, people learn to build a relationship with nature. And here I would like to offer my own testimony. I grew up in an agricultural town. My parents couldn't afford to send me to a gorgeous national park. But at that time, agriculture was not so intensive, so there were idle spots everywhere, between padlocks, along the railway, around houses, lots of them. And there was this small patch of native forest, very close to schools, very close to homes. It was heavily impacted by humans. It was full of vehicles, suffered fires, escaped from barbecues, all sorts of collateral damage from teenager picnic parties, you name it. But the most important things I learned from nature, those that defy time, were not learned in some fancy field course in the remote rainforest. They were learned in this very trashy ecosystem full of least concerned species. This changed my life much more than all my formal education in ecology. More generally, I think that wilderness areas and what to do with working landscapes, shared landscapes, are two completely different conversations. Wilderness and wildness close to people both deserve different kind of attentions. So putting them at opposite ends of a single trade-off, so that more wild spots close to people necessarily mean less wilderness areas, to me, is not the right approach. In summary and concluding, the nature as garden narrative, supported by the notion of nature as a living fabric, is more supported by the evidence and should be more just and more promising, in the sense of giving more hope, in the sense of giving more sense of agency, than the twin narratives, nature as spoils or nature as Eden. The twin narratives, Eden and spoils, might be somewhat discredited in the discourse, but they are live and ticking in many, many of our actions, regulations, and way of thinking. Therefore, a transition to a nature as garden narrative requires a shift in mindset from nature conquest plus wilderness worship towards interdependence and tolerance, realizing that this is a shared place, that the others, be them humans and otherwise, are there, alive, inextricably intertwined with us. They have to be negotiated with, and they deserve respect. As I said, I want to emphasize, wilderness and wildness are quite different conversations. We need them both. We deserve them both. So they shouldn't be traded off. And finally, even if we buy into the nature as garden narrative today and feel fully convinced and fully committed right now, 100% to it, there's still a lot of things we have no clue how to do. There's a lot of know-how, how to get there according to a nature as garden narrative. And I think all these knowledge gaps are because most of the methods and most of the technologies have been developed under the frame of the twin Eden and spoils narratives. So lots to do there, not only in fundamental thinking, but also in working out a lot of practical details. As you probably already suspected, we don't have a Garden of Eden anymore. But we still have a garden that in which remote influences are at least as important as local influences, a garden full of human and other than human agencies, a garden that deserves and needs our care, our attention, and our responsibility. Okay, I think I've been talking for more than 40 minutes now about narratives. Am I suggesting that narratives can change the world? Definitely they are not enough, but they set the stage. And we know very well how the wrong narratives can slow down change. So let's hope that better narratives can make change easier. Thank you.
Great. Okay. Thank you very much, Sandra, for that inspiring and also very beautiful presentation. So we'll open up to questions now for a while. I'll just kick off with one. And I think you make a very convincing argument there about why a garden narrative is needed as something in between the two extreme narratives. But is it possible that perhaps the garden narrative is still very overly anthropocentric? Depends on your gardening, I suppose, but generally humans are still in this driving seat, steering and shaping that garden. And is it really a reciprocal relationship sufficiently, or does it allow for enough agency for the wilder part of nature in that narrative? Do we really want a garden planet where humans are manicuring and curating everything on the planet?
One of the very common objections is that I would say two things. First, there are very, very different styles of gardening. You will see, you go around and you see the super tidy manicure garden and the completely messy garden. So there are very many different models. It doesn't have to be a manicure garden. Many people find the metaphor, the narrative, too much command and control, right? But then we are already in command and control now. I mean, we are, in a way, commanding and controlling what happens everywhere. So perhaps the point is taking responsibility for it. I mean, all these natural, supposedly natural areas that we are affecting very, very heavily, we are already affecting them, so we are already controlling them. The way they are already experience very anthropocentric impacts. So that's one reason I think that we just have to accept the fact that we are, unfortunately, in command and control, or maybe in command. I'm not sure we are in control, probably not in control. And the second thing I would say to you is it's about control. It's about the messy garden. Control is never complete. Yeah. Whoever thinks that by having this image of full control of what happens in nature, I think that's a fantasy. We have all these very vivid examples that there's many, many things in nature that is non-human agency, and it happens whether we like it or not, and whether we want complete control or not. COVID was one of them. I mean, we just completely overrode any command and control we had, and we ended up doing things we never dreamt we were going to have. So I think that's why I took so much time in explaining the details of the garden narrative. I think that the lack of complete control is inherent to it. Recognizing the non-human agency is part of the thing.
Okay, Thank you. Okay, well, we can open up to the floor to questions now. I can see there's somebody with a microphone here, so one in the middle and then one at the back. So.
You mentioned the difficulties with balancing who gets to control the garden. But how do you control, how do you like balance the priorities between different like animal species, for example, when their like interests are in conflict? So for example, when you're managing an invasive species, I mean, of course that's a narrative in and of itself, but when you're managing an invasive species, how do you balance, for example, the welfare of existing individuals within that species and potential individuals that may not be born if we do not, you know, cull individuals of the invasive species?
That's the bit about, I said, whose garden? There's no objective, perfect answer, right? As you say, there's no one official answer to that conflict between the invasive species and the resident species, or between you know, a dangerous piece of wildlife and people, right? To me, a key element coming into play is negotiation. So you admit this there, you admit that there is no perfect answers, you admit that whose garden is going to predominate needs to be negotiated with the humans and with the non-humans too. That would be a general answer. I'm going with you.
Hey, Sandra, thank you so much for such a lovely talk. Thanks, Yudvinder. Really enjoyed how you like linked the local to the less local to the international, and all of that was really interesting, something I'm really interested in. And also linking onto this question of whose garden. So you said if one of the comments you made was if you can't touch your garden, if you don't have contact with your garden, then you're not getting anything from your garden. But I wonder how you think that fits in with our international frameworks and our international perspectives, and that goes from Indigenous people to the local person who has a tiny garden to people who have no gardens, who just live in apartments, who are in fact living in this sort of more global space and thinking, I actually really love that place, even though I'll never see it again. Like people do with their families, right? I'll never see that my family member again, but I have to go away and provide for it in some other way. And so that was something I found quite like, it's something I have thought about a lot in my own career, but I wonder how you reconcile that with what you're saying about if I can't interact with it, if I can't have part of it, then I won't care so much about it, or I'm not getting anything from it. Whereas in fact, a lot of people in this room maybe are doing in fact exactly that, you know, are fighting for something they may never really have a tangible connection with, or interaction with, or feedback from either.
Yes. Do I need it I don't need the mic. That's okay, thank you. That's a great question. That's the difference between remember I talked about the global contributions to people and then the local ones. You mentioned one of the global. So two things. The satisfaction coming from knowing that something beautifully exists is kind of global. You don't need to be in touch with the thing, because you just, you know, I never seen, I don't know, a bird of paradise, right? But I know it exists and make me happy, and it will make me sad if it gets extinct. That's a global thing. But what I was talking about was the local nature's contributions to people. In which you need to see them every day, otherwise you don't benefit. You know, all the noise regulation, all the quality of air, all the quality of water, you know, the lower heart rate you get from just being in green speeds, it has to be close to you. So in your case, it was a global one, and also I don't know, many people, probably many of us, can afford to go to the places where the gorgeous nature is. Yeah, so you can afford visiting the wonderful wilderness and benefit from it. Many, many people around the world don't have that privilege, right? And I just worry that sometimes you say, okay, well, if we intensify very, very much all the urban space and all the agricultural space, we will have more wilderness areas. Yes, for those who can go there, yeah, at the cost of transforming the everyday spaces of people in, you know, completely detached from nature. So that's why I say we need both. We want the great wilderness, but also we want nature as embedded in our everyday life as we can, because it's good for us. And because, you know, it's good for all these humble species too, that in a way need us to keep going. Yeah.
There's a couple up the front here, so maybe do one here and then there afterwards.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for a very interesting talk and the changing of the narrative, if you like. Can I ask you, going from what you showed about the green spaces in Cairo, and I'd also like to draw in New Delhi as another example. So over a period of 1,000 years, social, economic, political, administrative changes have brought about a pretty intense, large megapolis with very little garden, if you like. How would you sort of integrate that, which has taken place over 1,000 years and evolved gradually into what's now needed?
I'm not sure, I think I didn't hear some critical bits of your question. How you integrate what exactly?
I think what I'm trying to say is that some of these changes that have taken place in nature, drawing from Egypt, Cairo, and from Delhi in India, over a period of 1,000 or more years, population pressure, administrative pressure have brought about these changes. And it's going to be quite difficult, and I don't know what your thoughts were on trying to see how we go forward.
Again, I would say it's a question of negotiating. And it's a question of not trading off the nature close to people versus the wilderness area. I don't know what would be there. I wouldn't dare even imagining from my place what would be the right gardening, so to speak, in places which have so ancient use and so dense use and populations like the ones you mentioned. But I think there should be a way. And probably if people start thinking in doing it with the bit of natures and with tolerance and with coexistence, then there should be a way. There's a lot of things that are done against the fabric of life, including other people, which are very damaging. Many of them are out of greed, right? Just out of sheer greed. But many others are just because we don't realize, we don't care, we don't take the trouble. And maybe there's a lot of things that can be done slightly different with little adjustments that are a start. But I'm not able to propose clear examples. I wouldn't dare.
If I add, there are many examples of old cities which have recently gone through greening. So many European cities, more recently, so Singapore, not as old a city, but certainly has built this narrative of a city in nature, and even quite dense urban cities can thrive with natural ecosystems in there. So, okay, Leah? Then you're next. Yeah.
Hi, Sandra. Great to see you. Lovely talk. I have a question, which one reaction is that the premise of the idea of nature kind of gets at this conflict that we see between the discipline of conservation, which aims at preventing extinction, protecting biodiversity, and perhaps ecology and ecosystem function, where we care about the functioning of a system and we recognize species drop out. And so I was curious to hear your thoughts on the implications of the idea of a garden for preventing extinction. What does it do? Do we accept a new paradigm where we allow extinction to occur, even if it is anthropogenic?
Right. I don't think a garden narrative should necessarily allow extinctions to occur. If anything, is probably one of the few options to stop extinctions to occur. Many extinctions are, many ways of preventing extinctions today are heavy gardening, right? Maybe, I always struggle with the word gardening, but I couldn't find any better. Because people think, you know, the perfect garden with the trimmed shrubs. No, it's just assuming that with that thing around it, you have a responsibility. And it depends on you in some things. You have to do something. If you leave it alone, it's not you free it, you abandon it, right? And I feel that, especially in conservation, if we just let things just go, we abandon it. Many species will already go extinct. There was a paper, I think it was 2 years ago, you know, just being very proud that in 30 years of conservation, we managed collectively with huge effort to save from the brink something like 30 to 50 species of mammals and birds. And I say, well, wonderful, I applaud them. But it's very, very little. And we did it with lots of gardening, right? So I think we are already gardening, right? So it's a question of being more aware and taking responsibility and say what kind of gardenings we want. I think the idea of just, okay, we leave alone, we just lock the door and leave nature alone is a fantasy. Yeah, it's already under our command and control. That's, I think, yeah.
There's one at the front here.
On the front.
Thank you. Surely we need to understand that we are part of the ecosystem ourselves. And the challenge should be for us to be able to live alongside nature without destroying it. I mean, you talked about slugs and things you don't want. Yeah. I've learned to live with slugs. You know, I eat things that the slugs don't eat. I'm making my garden into an edible forest garden. Right. And one of the hardest things for me to do was to stop control, was to stop trying to control everything and decide where everything was. Yeah. Allowing things to just come up. Surely that's what we should be aiming at. Just getting enough for us, but leaving the rest for everybody else, i.e. nature, insects, plants, all other living creatures.
Well, that's my, that was I was trying to convey, this acknowledging of the other's agency. You know, you acknowledge the agency of your slugs and say, okay, I have to negotiate with them. I have to live together with them. I don't want to exterminate them. And even if you want to exterminate, you won't. It's not possible. I mean, I have the same with many other creatures. I have all these garden stories. Even if you want to have complete command control, there's no way.
But also they have a function.
Yeah,
You know,
but
it's not for us to say, you know, they're all in a whole food chain. If you take something out, something else will happen. We don't know everything that's going to happen to do that. So we have to just not try and control everything, except that it's there for a reason.
yeah, I mean, I guess the negotiation with the slugs is slightly, you know, I can think of much more difficult negotiations than with the slug. Yeah. So that's, you know, we don't have to be, you know, all fluffy, airy-fairy. I'm not trying to convey that kind of message. Some negotiations are kind of really difficult, but they have to be addressed, I think. It's not a question of locking them away or keeping under full control.
Katrina?
Hi, it's a fantastic talk. I'm just interested in the narrative of garden, because even in our culture, it's a kind of luxury. It's a place where you go for leisure. And it seems to me that there are many people who can't afford a garden, but that there are models of working landscapes, allotments, for example, which in English wouldn't be a garden, and are some of the most biodiverse habitats in the UK. Or, for example, meadows that are again some of the most biodiverse habitats. And so that there is, and there's a sort of symbiosis there that of a working landscape that is dependent on the scythe or the tractor for its biodiversity. And so, just in a sense, for me, we need nature for as a working landscape, and we can live in it symbiotically rather than just for our delight in the garden.
Well, I couldn't agree more strongly. When I say garden, I don't mean ornamental garden, right? It's just garden in general. And, you know, there is a vegetable garden, there is a patchy, weedy garden. It means something which is in which you have agency, but there's other agencies too, in which you invest time and effort and care, and which gives you something. You know, it could be material or non-material. So that meaning gardening. So I couldn't agree more strongly that all these meadows and different patches and all these diversification techniques, to me, are the way to go. To me, they are more human, more fair, particular than other models. But that's my opinion. I'm very aware, that's why I didn't want to go into the weeds with the two models, diversification or intensification, because the intensification model also has very strong arguments, right? And to be fair, you need to examine them very, very thoroughly, very respectfully, and I didn't have time in my talk. I personally think like you. But other people don't think like that. Yeah.
Okay, we'll take a couple more questions. Lily at the back, and then one on the right there.
Hi, thank you so much. This is a very useful framing. And I'm just very curious to hear from you how you describe your scientific wish list to be, like the kinds of research that you wish, you know, more scientists across different disciplines were trying to answer with respect to some of the challenges that you raise?
You mean the ones I would like to versus the ones that are needed, which is not always the same thing.
Sure, yes, maybe both, but with a focus on whatever you personally wish that more people worked on.
I think that this, my personal interests are probably a little bit boring. So I will start with what is needed. Everything I've been saying today, it's, you know, it's easy in words, but in practice, many of these things, we don't know how to do them, you know? You say, okay, how will you negotiate in, you know, in an agricultural patch that you have, I don't know, just metaphorically, the lettuce, the slug, the ants, the tomatoes, the little guy that is just playing around. It's incredible, but we don't have the fundamental science to answer that question or say, okay, how big they should be. Sometimes for example, we did a paper a couple of years ago, and apparently having as much as 20% of wild spots between cultivation plots, depending on the crop, you don't lose money. You even, depending on the crop, may have a profit, right? But we know that for a few crops in a few places. For many, many other systems, we have no clue exactly practically how to do it, right? And how to make it fair. And all these, another example, the telecoupling I was thinking about the global biodiversity footprint. How you make, for a country, practical. If a country is, probably no country in the world now, but imagine a country say, we want to document every year in our national communications to the CBD our global biodiversity footprint. It's very difficult. We starting there. I mean, not me. My colleagues started there, but it's very difficult. The methods and the techniques are still not there. So there's plenty of things to do.
Yeah, thanks for that. I have a pretty simple question about potency of a narrative. You showed that most consumption is clustered in, well, here and these parts. And I guess the perennial problem with narratives has been that we need to have narratives that transcend the borders. And whether this potency of the garden narrative will diminish the moment the garden is, say, in Borneo, Indonesia, Cambodia, South America, when the consumption is happening here. This seems to be like a sort of thorn at our side all the time.
I'm sure that in very few places in the universe, the narrative of nature as a garden would resonate more than in the UK, because you guys love gardens, right? That's a joke. But no, seriously, I wish to believe that it could appeal very easily to people everywhere. I haven't had, of course, the practical test of it. I would need to go and, but it seems to me that it resonates with the logic of many people around the world. I haven't been with them, but I read the papers that, they keep nature close. Maybe not in the best way, maybe not under the best model. Most of the time, it's a question of people sitting and thinking and rethinking things and finding practical ways to do it. For example, I can take you a bit of my experience. In Córdoba city and province, everyone uses herbicide for cleaning gardens, for cleaning the streets from weeds, for cleaning railway sides, for cleaning road verges, everything, just herbicide, Roundup, basically. Why? Because they are evil? No. Because it's easy. They are lazy, they don't know, it's easy, it's tidier. And I like to believe that a reflection of how dangerous is not only for other life, for their own health. And it's an alternative solution, a practical alternative solution could shift things. It's very difficult. For example, we had this great plan of changing the management of the road verges. We have kilometers and kilometers of really, really, really wide road verges. They are not like that. That's why I'm very scared of driving here, because there's no road verge, right? Those many, many kilometers are, just completely mowed and treated with Roundup, and there's nothing other than a little bit of grass there. So we made this, or soybean, because whenever the agricultural lobby can get away with it, they just use it for soybean. It's forbidden, but they do it anyway. So anyway, we came up with a big plan to not foresting the road barriers, but just leaving them alone. Just letting nature come back. They easily come back because the soil is still full of seeds and sprouts. So in 3-4 years, you have wonderful, humble nature, not a puma or something really fancy. It was perfect. It was, cheaper, less work, less money, everything. Everybody was happy, everybody. We couldn't make it happen because all the little institutional steps and all the little sections of different municipal and provincial government just couldn't change. They found it complicated. So to me, the challenge is not so much in people seeing that they can do things differently, but in going against all these legacies that in the institutional structure.
We should bring the questions to a close there, but I'd like to mention we have a drinks reception around the corner, so do linger and have a more informal conversation, either with Sandra or with each other. So finally, just thank you, Sandra, for an eloquent and inspirational talk that gives us much to think about. And I look forward to conversations over the next weeks and months to discuss these ideas further.
Okay, thank you for all your efforts.